So again, really thank you for being here and taking the time. To remind us, I'm going to be talking about a particular lens through which to look at what's happening in conflict. It is just one of a number of ways that we can look at conflict, and to remind us of how important it is to think about what the source of a conflict is when we're dealing with a conflict. Let me share with you this kind of rubric or topology. So people often are coming in to fight about issues, yeah? And they are attending to those issues. If, however, the problem, the source of their conflict isn't really at the issue level, but is at a relational level. So let me give you an example. A married couple, husband and wife, male and female, and they are fighting about how they discipline the children, how come you're always leaving the dirty laundry on the bathroom floor, why are you so profligate in your spending, whatever the issues are that they're fighting about, yeah? If actually the source of their conflict is at the relational level, they are not demonstrating care for each other, love for each other, respect for each other, until they solve it at that level, these things are going to keep on happening and they're going to be hard to resolve, right? But let's say in this case, they are both working full-time. They have 3 children under the age of 5, and the money they bring home every month is just enough to pay the bills, right? That's a structural dimension in their lives that will create pressure on their relationship, and they will probably be fighting over various issues, yeah? As you go up this scale, it's harder to resolve the problem or address the problem. I have friends in Portland who were both working full-time for the same international nonprofit. They had their first child, and then they decided to adopt another one. They rearranged their work schedules so that one was working, they were both working half-time. One would be home in the morning, one would be home in the afternoon. They addressed a structural situation in their life that probably helped their relationship, and they had, yeah. So in this case, again, at the systemic level, in the States, research is showing still that even in today's world, if a man and a woman are married and they're both working full-time, still the woman is doing 75% of the housework, 75% of the childcare, yeah? So that's a systemic level thing. It's a cultural reality that filters down to at the family level. In the workplace, every time I work with an organization, I'm brought in to deal with one issue or another, whether it's interpersonal, employee conflict that I'm mediating, or I'm working with a group or between 2 groups. I am always asking, are there structural dimensions to the conflict that is presenting itself, yeah? This just to show, I mean, this is, I use this, I put this on flip charts in just about every mediation I do, or any work I'm doing with an organization, just because it helps people kind of see what is actually going on here. Is this really the problem, or is it maybe here in some dimension, yeah? So I share this partly because I've always found it very enlightening, but more I'm sharing it to remind us how important it is to identify what is the actual source of the problem here, so that we can then address it. The source of the problem that I'm going to be talking with you about today is us, is how we function as human beings, right? Because we are indeed human beings, and we are working with human beings, and human beings are physical organisms. And they function according to certain characteristics of the body that affect how we engage with each other. We don't tend to think of ourselves as physical organisms. Each of us, I'm a me. I live in my body, but I'm not my body. Indeed, I think we are our bodies. Now, and let me say parenthetically, whatever you believe about soul, spirit, disembodied, whatever your religious or spiritual beliefs are, it doesn't dispute the fact, and it is not contradictory with the fact that how our brain works affects how our mind works, yeah? We know this from brain injury. Phineas Cage, do you know the story of Phineas Cage? He was in the 19th century, a railroad worker who a spike of some sort went into his head and pierced his brain, but not sufficiently to kill him. He survived. But his personality changed dramatically, and it was in the early stages of neuroscience, we were realizing, whoa, the personality changes when you change the brain. But so from brain injury we know from drug effects, we know from brain disease, dementia, etc. We know from surgical intervention that when you change the brain, you change cognition, you change identity. If any of you have had experience with somebody with Alzheimer's, the person you knew is disappearing. They're still there, but they have a different identity, yeah? So again, whatever you believe about soul spirit, that's not a question. We know that the brain and the mind are either intimately linked or, one could say, identical. Again, you're probably familiar with this, just reminding Moore's triangle, important to, you may satisfy the substantive issues, but if the process for doing that in a business, let's say, a decision is made that resolve a particular question or problem, but if the process for achieving that decision is unsatisfactory, you've still got a problem in the organization, right? People need procedural satisfaction, they need relational satisfaction. In a family, a autocratic father might make a decision that resolves the issue, but it might not be a happy place, yeah? So again, just reminding that it's important to think about what is the source of the problem we're facing. You've all seen this, data conflict relation. I don't want to talk too much about it. The same point made. So, 2 quotes. The weight of evidence now implies that it is the brain rather than some non-physical stuff that thinks, feels, thinks, and decides. Patricia Churchland is a wonderful writer, a neurophilosopher. Complex psychological functions must arise from bodily structures. There's no other source for them. Now that's a strong statement because somebody could say to me, wait, the spirit that I come into this world with is also a source for my psychological functions. Maybe that's true, we can have that conversation. Regardless, the bodily structures when they're changed, change the psychological functions, and it is psychological functions that we're dealing with when we're working with people, yeah? So the key core idea that I write about in the book is that we encode perceptual experience in neural structures. That's the function of the brain that allows for learning. Without that, we could not learn. For memory, for the ability to think, and indeed for identity, yeah? It's a very simple and obvious idea, and we don't need to, neuroscience at this point does not know how that works. We know very little about how memory works. We know very little about the complex neural function that allows us to have the robust and rich consciousness experience that we have. But we do know that somehow the brain does encode, does somehow record in response to perceptual experience neural structures that are abiding and that allow us then to have knowledge, to know, to think, indeed to have an identity. And it begins actually prior to birth. So that the growing fetus, at the point when the nervous system has developed sufficiently to begin to, this process of encoding, of remembering, begins to encode the mother's voice or the father's voice, particularly the mother's voice, yeah, because being inside the mother, begins to encode the cadences, the rhythms, the structures of the language into which they're being born. So that when, after birth, the child hears the mother's voice, those neural structures that have already been established are activated so that there's this recognition, this recognition, yeah? It's that function of encoding and developing these webs, these nets, these matrices of neural connections that is what provides for your ability to be thinking right now, to be feeling who you are. All of your consciousness is based on the fact that you are an assemblage of a complex web of neural structures that have certain characteristics that have been established by your experience, yeah? And it continues on through life. That's who we meet as neural beings. So encodes learning, memory, we connect So you can't imagine a flying pig. All of you can imagine a flying pig. How is that so? Because there are no flying pigs in the world. But you can imagine a flying pig because you have had experience with pigs and with flying. And so you can connect those two that have been encoded in neural structures in some mysterious way that we can retrieve to now imagine flying pigs. You cannot imagine flying pigs if you have not had some experience previously with pigs or flying, yeah? So I'm going to say that what you know is who you are, that there's an intimate connection between knowing and identity, that when we meet each other right now, who you are and how you perceive me is based on your experience. That psychology is biology shaped by genetics and experience. We know there's the term epigenetics, which is what we come in with a genetic inheritance, but what gets expressed depends on experience, yeah? And so all of us are this mix, this blend. You are the summation of the genetic inheritance you have and your experience from pre-birth on to this moment. And all of that is encoded, is embodied in these neural structures that are always happening, very dynamic. And again, we don't think of ourselves in these terms, but this is what is happening. And I'll talk more about the implications for that. Okay. Sorry to be going so quickly. If anybody has a comment, question, please do, but I do want to end by 10. So in the book I talk about these 7 characteristics. I won't talk about them all right now, but connectivity, coherence, consistency has to do with the fact that the brain has to have a coherent picture of the world at any one time. If suddenly I started to float to the ceiling, or behind me an elephant started to appear through the wall, yeah? Each of you in the moment would suddenly be trying to fit that new perceptual experience into your understanding of the world. There cannot be any outliers. You have one view, and parties come into the mediation with their understanding of the world, and you in mediation are presenting them with new ideas, new perspectives, a different way of looking at the conflict. That has to fit into their narrative somehow, into their story of the world. So stability, plasticity, balance, key point. Let me go. I'll say more about that in a second. Activation is that phenomenon that allows us then to experience knowing. So right now, the reason you can understand my words is a result of the stimuli of my words entering into you and activating the neural structures that have been established in your brain that are associated with those word sounds, yeah? We are always being activated by every person. That's how we experience the world, because we take in only through our 5 senses. We have only 5 senses in which to understand the world. And from those 5 senses, we have this remarkable experience of what it means to be alive and what is happening out there, yeah? Full of meaning. The world is full of meaning, but it's only touch, sight, sound, smell, yeah? That's all it is, stimuli. They come in, they get encoded, associated with other stimuli to create meaning, and then those meanings, embodied in enduring neural structures, get activated by new stimuli. Delay between stimulus response is a quality that humans have to a degree that no other living organism does. Reptiles, when they're stimulated, they respond right away. We have that ability to delay our response. Less so when we're under threat, yeah? And it's in conflict resolution, we're trying to increase that reactivity, yeah? Expectancy is a term that Don Tucker, the neuroscientist, used. I'll have a few quotes from him. He wrote 2 wonderful books, Mind from Body and Cognition and Neural Development. Lovely books if you're interested in that field. But it's a term he uses to talk about the fact that in any given moment, I am the sum of all of the experience I've had to that moment, embodied in neural structures, yeah? And I meet the next moment only with the expectation of what I've known up to this moment. When they diverge from that, then something has to happen. Either I incorporate the new information, develop new connections, neural connections, or I dismiss it, and we'll talk more about that. I won't say, I'll talk about this in a while, and memory I'm not going to talk much about today, but there's some discussion in the book about it. But anyway, so the fact that we need a coherent, consistent view of the world, of our understanding, leads to three conclusions. One is that concepts of logical or rational thinking divorced from emotional content and survival motives are incorrect. When we are dealing in mediation, do not make the mistake that emotions are not there and that you don't have to deal with them. No, you have to deal with them because they're in the room. And we tend to be a little bit afraid. We want to be logical and rational, and yeah, emotions feel a bit threatening because things might get out of control. But the emotions are there. And so how do we help parties acknowledge the emotions, be able to name the emotions without being flooded by the emotions, yeah? But it's when we deny them that we get into some problems, and we have resolutions that are not satisfactory or that are incomplete, yeah? Second implication, the myriad elements of perception must fit into some, so I've already talked about that there has to be this coherence. So that means that if you're reaching impasse in your mediation, one of the questions to ask is, what is it about the settlement proposal that doesn't fit into your worldview or your sense of self, yeah? It's not, the impasse is not something to be afraid of, it's some information, it's an indicator that there's not a fit somewhere, because as soon as the parties arrive at something that fits, you're done, you got it. But you have to figure out how, what's necessary to fit, why doesn't it fit, what needs to be added to make it fit, yeah? And then we can only hold one point of view or understanding or picture of the world at a time. We can move, we can have nuanced understandings, and we can move from one perspective to another, but at any given moment, we can only see one thing at a time. We know this from those perceptual exercises of the Necker cube. You know, the one that cube, that outline, you look at it one way and it's this way, and you look at it another way. Or the old woman, young woman, you're all familiar? Yeah. We know it also from binocular rivalry. When in research, you split the visual field, you present the two eyes with two incongruent images, and the brain flicks back and forth between the two beyond your volition, because the brain can't see both. And it makes sense, because evolutionarily, if we have inconsistent and contradictory perceptions of the world, we can't navigate, right? We have to see it one way. The chair is there. It's not there and there. Yeah? So, this is key, obviously. So on the one hand, we have to be able to depend on what we've already learned for evolutionary reasons, obviously, yeah? We have to be able to depend on that. We have to believe it's true. But on the other hand, for evolutionary fitness reasons, we need to be able to learn new things. But there's always, I think my next slide, does it? Yeah. So openness to new information, secure attachment to previously encoded, exist in a dynamic tension. There's always this balance of receptivity and skepticism. This is happening right now, as you listen to me. On the one hand, so you're always kind of questioning, is what I am saying a match with what you already know or not? Do you agree with me or not? We're always on the verge of disagreement, right? We're always ready to challenge each other. The reason that your brain is asking, the reason you're asking, do I agree with this guy or not, what he's saying, is that you're always trying to evaluate what is real, what is true, what is good, yeah? There's a kind of inertia to what we've already learned, so you may be familiar with Thomas Kuhn's work, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, in which he talks about the resistance to paradigm shift in the scientific world, yeah? Where we have a paradigm, we have an understanding of the world, of what the meaning is, yeah? And that's true. And then how hard it is to shift sometimes when a new understanding is offered that may be actually more true but not yet accepted. And that's the pattern that's happening in conflict resolution. Conflict resolution is a change process. And there is resistance to change, because when you ask me to change my mind, you are speaking not only figuratively, you are speaking literally, changing the body. And there's, for the reasons that we're talking about, can be quite a lot of resistance to that change, as you know when you mediate. Or you may know in your own personal lives when you're struggling with somebody and somebody espouses a point of view that is very different from your understanding. And you can feel that, I cannot get that through my mind, so to speak, right? New learning is constrained by prior learning. And again, conflict resolution is a learning process. It's a change process. We want, if there's no change, there's no resolution. We want people to come out of mediation different than they came in. That's what we're asking them. That's how, it's very profound. Changing what you know changes who you are. Take it in, that's what we're doing in mediation. We can be cavalier about it. We can, oh, this is just about the issues, right? This is just about dollars and cents or whatever. No, it's actually about people's identity, their understanding of the world. And being sensitive to that then can help us work with them more and help them in that transition. And under conditions of threat, we're less willing to change and are not those parties that we're working with in conflict under threat, yeah? Because they are both being told by each other that they're wrong. We do not like to be wrong, we like to be right. Okay. So this is just a quote from Tucker. When a discrepancy is encountered, then you face the stability plasticity dilemma. You can stay the same. I'm not going to agree to this settlement agreement, and therefore I'm stable, right? I'm the same person, I'm not changing. In which case you are uninformed, but at least you preserve the historical self. You can or you can change. You can choose plasticity and become informed. But in the process, you have to give up the old self and confront the painful novelty of a new identity. The cost of new learning is abandoning your old self. Now, he's saying this in a very extreme way. He's saying it as a neuroscientist, not as a conflict resolution practitioner. He's talking about what he believes is actually happening in the learning process. And it's not bad to lose your old, it's wonderful to lose your old self. To grow, to learn. Think of a child who's 5, 6, 7, they're constantly changing who they are. 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 19, 20, we're growing, we're changing, this is wonderful, but we get more resistant. So activation, again, as I said, you understand what I'm saying because neural structures are being activated in each of your brains. That's what's happening right now. So each of you, you don't see me. I mean, you see me, you see this physical object behaving in the way that it is, but your understanding of me is not about me. Your understanding of me is about what gets activated in you by the perception of me. And what gets activated in each of you is different because you have different neural structures that have been established by your past experience, right? So I'm a different person for each of you. Spreading activation in the fact, so an extension of the understanding of the fact that we are activated, that's our experience of the world is a function of neural activation. And if for any reason, for instance, under anesthesia, we're no longer able to be activated, so we don't experience the world, right? If we're just waking up from sleep, we're kind of groggy. We're less ready to be activated by the perceptual stimuli, yeah? We're not as sharp, as we might say, yeah? But that function then, because the webs of knowledge, of knowing, of understanding in the brain are interconnected in complex ways. So your understanding of tree, for instance, began with just the word, the nonsense syllable, tree. Didn't mean anything. As an infant, a child, at one point, when you learned about trees that you hadn't known about before, you encoded that sound, tree, in a neural structure, mysterious. And you also encoded the visual perception of the object that we call tree. And that was the beginning of your learning about trees, yeah? But then as you continued to live, you had lots more experience with trees that also got encoded, all the way up to the forests and the connection between forests and climate change. You have this extensive web of knowledge, neural structures having to do with trees. And so one thing can lead to another, and this is what spreading activation, this is what trauma reactivity is. That we're activated by a particular perception in the moment, and yet it cascades into all of the memories related to the trauma in ways that impact our experience in the moment. There's always a preferential bias with any stimulus. We can't help but be activated. So, all of we'll talk more about perceptual biases, but all of the you will not be able to not have activation experience, associations to any perceptual stimuli. So the moment we see somebody else, as we look at each other, we are activated. I see you in a certain way, and you have meaning to me based on what gets activated in me, and it happens in milliseconds. So Don Tucker, this is we know that. So the brain is a whole brain, and there's this connectivity and consistency and coherence. We know that there are morphological aspects. There are structural specializations of a sort. So we know the two hemispheres, obviously. Front back, there are differentiations in terms of the function of the brain front back, and also from lower brain to neocortex. But Tucker talks about this thing called the ventral and dorsal system. And this, I think, really interesting for us in conflict resolution work. So the dorsal system is that system that is expressive of personal motives, personal urges, personal experience out into the world. So as I'm speaking with you, my dorsal system is pretty active because I have to be in touch with what I want to be saying, what I know, yeah? The ventral system is that system that is perceiving what's on the outside and paying attention to that. And of course, there's always a balance. Each of us have to be paying attention to what's going on outside for survival reasons. And depending on if there was sudden an emergency here, if there were fire or some threat, we would have to then pay much more attention to what's going on outside. At the extreme, so this is just different ways of saying it: self-emphasis, other emphasis, mode of arousal, reactivity. In the extreme, the dorsal system is narcissistic. I don't care what's going on outside in a way, right? I'm mostly focused on my own experience. At the extreme on the ventral level is anxiety and paranoia. I remember a case that I had, a divorce case in which the husband was around 42, the wife was about 29, and he had made a lot of money, entrepreneurial. They had a huge ranch, lots of horses. She had no experience with managing, didn't need to manage the money, didn't need to deal with any of that. She just worked and played with the horses. She just, that was her life. They came into mediation. He spoke a lot. She said nothing for 2 sessions. And as much as I would try to bring out from her, it was very difficult. And he was a narcissist, my judgment, but I'm pretty sure he would be classed as a narcissist. So what was happening is that he was much more in the door, and he really didn't want to take into account what was on the outside, what she needed. And she was the reverse, so I had to work with, I didn't have this terminology at that point, but it was an example, I think, of this imbalance. So, in conflict resolution, we're talking about speaking and listening. That's what we need, both of those. So we need people to be in touch with what they need and what they feel and what they want and how they see the world, but we also need them to be able to listen. And so we have to work with that balance of dorsal ventral system. So some implications. I've been working in this field for 26 years, so that means every day, pretty much every day. I mean, I don't think a day goes by where I'm not either thinking about or teaching about or writing about or practicing in this field that we call conflict resolution, and everything that has to do with communication, relationship, humanity. I mean, that's really what we're about, what we're dealing with. And this perspective of neural function has deepened my appreciation for what's actually happening between us in relationship, in communication, in ways that affected my personal life and my professional life. So I talk about these 2, 4, 6, 7 areas in the book. Let me say a few things about some of them. So recognizing that what is happening in communication is that we are sending sounds, I am eliciting, I am activating in me meaning matrices that produce sounds that travel from my body to your body. Those sounds carry no meaning. They are just sounds. They are meaningless, but in themselves, but they activate in you, as I've been saying, meaning associations. Realizing this really emphasizes how intimate communication is. Most of the time it doesn't matter. We're trying to decide what restaurant to go to lunch with somebody or whatever. But at important moments with our children or in a conflict in the workplace, in our mediation, it's then important to remember how intimate this communication act is. That my words actually enter into your body and ask of you or demand of you or threaten to change your body, to change who you are. That's what we're asking of each other. For you to consider what I'm saying is to consider changing who you are, So then the vulnerability, the potential for violence, if more parents understood what's actually happening at the neural level, that it's not true that sticks and stones can break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Words do impact, maybe more damagingly than sticks and stones, for young children, and how we speak with them and how we behave with them and the messages we give them about who they are. The same is true with the parties that we're working with. What messages do we give them about who they are, and how we behave with them, and how we speak with them, what our words mean to them? So that has become, more profoundly visible to me, seeing it in this way, and so that leads to how the responsibility we have when we're communicating. And I think we forget that sometimes. And in conflict, how violent we can be and what we're trying to help parties do is to be nonviolent, in their communication. And then the easy possibility for misunderstanding. This is seeing the neural reality of experience helps us understand how misunderstandings happen. Because when I speak, I have meaning associations with these word sounds. I send them across to you. I assume that the meaning associations you have are the same that I have. But that may not be the case. What gets activated in you might be different than what's activated in me in association with those meaningless those meaningless sounds. So, and we the misunderstanding will be invisible to us because of the assumptions we both have. My assumption that my intention matches what gets activated in you, and your assumption that what gets activated in you is what I meant. And it may not be. So it means in mediation then to be very careful about being sure that people are meaning the same thing with their words, and to get ahead a little bit, but in terms of implications for our practice, we know that one of the things that we do is, we write down the issues. Let's identify first the issues. What are the issues that you're coming in with? Tell me about what you want to accomplish here. And we may write them down on the flip chart. Oh, good, we've got the issues. Any more issues? Party A, party B, yeah, we've got them down. Let's move on to our next step. But do those issues mean the same thing to each of the parties? So I think that there's a danger of moving too quickly in all of the stages and all of the parts of the mediation that we do, because we make assumptions about common meanings that may not be there. So I'm spending more time after we name things to say, what do those names mean to you? Tell me more about that. And maybe there'll be time to talk more about that. So every stimulus affects us because we're activated by everything. So as mediators, it's not just our words, it's our tone, as you say, it's our pitch, it's our pace, and it's our body. It's how we breathe, it's how we, it's whether we nod or not, it's everything, yeah. So we bring our whole body to, because every perception is activating one way or another. And so that's why culturally, in one culture, to look directly in the eye of somebody is to be very present and respectful. In another culture, that same behavior is seen as disrespectful. And so those cultural differences of bodily behavior will have different meanings, and different consequences. So perceptual biases, in the States right now, I want to tell everybody that I'm Canadian, I'm not American. I live in this country called America, which is a total disaster right now, as far as I'm concerned. Very difficult situation over there. But as you may have read, there have been many, many police shootings of black men and black boys. And so the subject of implicit bias is all the rage right now. It's everywhere. Of course we have implicit bias. All of us have biases because we are the sum of all of the impressions, and I say that word again literally, not figuratively. Stimuli impress themselves upon us and create impressions, neural impressions that remain, just as if we pressed and made that mark. So we're all walking around with biases, with implicit biases. Confirmation bias also talked a lot about with climate change and climate change deniers, and the fact that for all of us, it's difficult to take in information that contradicts the knowledge structures that we already have, because they are asking us to change not only what we know, but who we are. So confirmation bias is only happens when the incoming information requires a change in neural structure that is too great to tolerate. It's the only reason confirmation bias happens. Once it's no longer too great to tolerate, we accept the new information, So in working with parties, when one party just cannot see or will not accept the information that's coming to them, one question to ask is, what is it about the information that is too difficult to tolerate? What is it about the change that is suggested by that information that is too great to tolerate? So, all of the, naive realism is that fact for all of us that we all walk around thinking that my understanding of the world is the right understanding of the world. That's where we begin. And then we meet each other with our different perspectives, and we're going to fight over that a little bit because, damn it, I'm right about the world, And we have to feel right about the world in order to navigate the. It's a crazy condition to not have confidence in your own understanding of the world to some degree, right? And of course we have that ability to temper our certainty, but we begin at some fundamental level with attachment to our view. And naive realism then relates to or moves to that fundamental attribution error in which if we are in disagreement, I attribute your perspective to your ignorance and my perspective to my sagacity, right? And that's happening right now. We're doing that right now. I assume that if you disagree with me, something wrong with you. You're not getting it. Yeah. And I've got the right view. Yeah. And so we're working with those neurally based perceptual experiences when we're working with parties. I won't go through more of them right now. So again, to reiterate, an individual's actions in the world arise out of and make sense within the context of their self-identity story. In conflict resolution, we're asking them to change their story somehow. We all want to be the hero in our story or the positive protagonist in our own story, right? We don't want to be the devil or the evil one or the wrong one or the bad one. In conflict, the parties are telling each other that they're the wrong, the bad, the ugly, the not good, yeah? Of course there's going to be resistance. You're telling me I'm wrong? No. So somehow we have to work with these stories, and the settlement has to, even in cases of real betrayal. I had a divorce case recently in which after 15 years of marriage, the wife who thought she'd been in this just wonderful marriage discovered that the husband had not only had numerous affairs, had stolen money from their accounts and hidden it in all kinds of complicated ways, and had initiated a story within their marriage. After about 10 years of their marriage, they hadn't been able to afford a really expensive ring when they were married. At one point, 10 years later, he said, sweetie, I'm gonna get you that we can afford it now. And he got her this $20,000 diamond ring. And it was kind of a story in the family, and the kids, were very proud of their father. In this betrayal event, she learned that the ring was not $20,000. It was like, $500 ring or something. So she came in, her world was shattered. Her neural structures of understanding were shattered. But even in that, somehow, in working through some kind of resolution, because they had to keep co-parenting, and so they had to be in relationship, how could a story be told that didn't make him the devil, even though he had done some really bad things? And that's what we're working in the field of restorative justice. Injury has been done, but how do we create a story in which the perpetrator can move on and live on and grow and learn? How do we create a story in which they can be a positive protagonist in some way or another? Requires the illusion of a unified sense of self. And so any settlement agreement has to fit into their identification, their definition of self. And if they're resistant, maybe there's a way in which the settlement can't be incorporated yet into their understanding of who they are. Just some quick quotes, but I love them. It's the same stuff. The cost of new learning may be abandoning your old self. I guess we had that already. Yeah. So again, and that's the same thing. I've got to move quickly, I'm sorry. But yeah, so now what is the question for us as practitioners? If we understand, if we recognize that this is how communication works, this is how this is what is happening in relationship, and the implications, as we've talked about, what does it mean for practice? In the book, I look at 4 areas. This was the hardest part of the book to write, and in my own practice, I am thinking in each case, okay, with this, what's going on here, And is there any way in which this neural understanding might enlighten me about how to mediate differently? Yeah, how might I either structure the mediation differently, or my interventions might change? And so I look at 4 categories. And the first, in theoretical issues, I look at these, and I'm going to just let you kind of scan these. If there's one that pops out for you that you'd like to talk about in the time that we have left, remember that. A couple that strike out for me here is positions and interests. We so maybe cavalierly ask the parties to move from positions to interests, but that's asking them to move from certainty to uncertainty. And they may not be ready. It may be okay to let parties stay with their positions until we've created enough safety and enough comfort to that they feel ready to become more interest-based. And how do we create that comfort? That has to do with then party storytelling, which comes later. But yeah, so I talk about stages of the process, first contact, joint session, party storytelling, yeah, here. That, you know, in some thinking about conflict resolution, we have said there's a danger in talking too much about what has happened, about the past. We are future-oriented, right? I'm disagreeing with that at this point in my practice. I think that the parties need to be heard and understood. They need to be brought in. They need to feel that they are known in the room. So they need to tell their story. The challenge is to help them tell their story without it being an attack on the other. And what tends to happen is I'm telling my story and it's just repeating the conflict narrative rather than talking about what my experience is. And I think we can help parties do that. That's the sharing that can lead to better mutual understanding and then hopefully resolution. And it's once they've done that, then we can go into interests. Yeah, we can talk about interests. And then I talk about these practice issues. It was a bit arbitrary, these things that I came up with and which category I put them into, but I had to kind of make some sense in the book as I talked about things. Somatic interventions, I've had some interesting conversations in some earlier presentations, and by that I mean, you know, what can we do with body to help the parties? And you know, I don't know about you, I would suspect this would be true of you as well in your work, but you know, I'll often use breathing. I might say when somebody tells a story, I might, wow, that's hard, that's difficult, yeah. Really physically express that so that they can then breathe. But are there other things that we can do, and what are the limitations that we have of both party expectations, about our limitations of our own competencies? But you know, we might say, how about everybody, should we take a little break here, stand up, walk around, whatever somatic interventions might be helpful. And then I talk about these process design considerations. Online asynchronous mediation is becoming less of an issue because we have video conferencing now. So it's less of an issue, but I talk about it a bit. Site visits in public disputes, so important. I remember a case we had a hydroelectric facility relicensing negotiation that included federal, state, local agency representatives and local elected officials, environmentalists, recreational interests, et cetera, et cetera. And it was quite contentious. And one day this lasted over a period of, I can't remember, 14 months or something. We would meet once a month or maybe a bit more. And one session, we walked out to the facility and we were walking beside this fish ladder. And there were, you know, trees and woods, and there was this fish ladder, which was this deep, concrete, stepwise structure, and there wasn't very much water in it. And we looked down, and there was this big salmon stuck in a pool, and there wasn't enough water for it to get to the next. All of us looked down at the salmon, and it changed the negotiation entirely. So site visits, again, people were activated by this event, and yeah, so I want to leave you with 3 quotes that I find very interesting in relationship to what we're talking about. If we learn how we think, how our mind is structured, and how to overcome the innate limitations and biases of mind, can we then learn to act on that knowledge? Paul Ehrlich, the population guy, population bomb, etc. Robert Ornstein is a neuroscientist. Nick Humphrey, neuroscientist, and Joseph Ledoux, also a neuroscientist. All of their works, these works that I'm referring to, are in the references in the book. Clever thinking about the way the brain works, not just about how the mind works, may be a key to progress. And isn't that, fundamentally what our work is involved with? We're trying to make a change in the world about how people live together. Fundamentally. And so the connection between commercial mediation and peacemaking planet-wide is there. We're all working in trying to help human relationships be less destructive, less violent, less abuse of power, more collaborative. This is the work that we're involved in. So that's the progress that we want to achieve somehow, and maybe understanding this physical organism more might help us in that regard. The time will come when the issue of human responsibility in general moral terms, as well as on matters of justice and its application, will take into account the evolving science of consciousness. Perhaps the time is now. And we are so, who knows what's going to happen in 100 years, 200 years in terms of our understanding of this complex organ. Gerald Edelman, a neuroscientist, claimed that if you began counting the number of synapses in your brain now at the rate of 1 synapse per second, it would take you 32 million years to count all those synapses. 32 million years at 1 a second, That's how complex this organism is that allows for our, robust, rich experience of life. And that's not even taking into account the many connections, the interconnections that can happen. So there will probably be more understanding of how we function as human beings. And I'm just saying, with this lens, that really recognizing that we are neural beings, that are all of our consciousness experience, that what we're dealing with parties, what they believe, what they know, what they think they know, what they understand, who they are, all of those experiences are happening as a result of this neural encoding and neural connecting and neural activation function that may shed some light on what's actually going on.